So welcome, Sarah Phillimore. Would you mind introducing yourself and giving us a bit of a background about what you do? You're a barrister in family law, but you also do many other things, and you're a lawfare warrior as well.
Oh, God. Yes, well, I was a blameless middle-aged family law barrister just trotting along. I was quite interested in activism, but it was more very focused on the work I was doing. I set up the Child Protection Resource website because I was worried about the quality of information being given to parents.
Yes.
So that was in 2014. But then my sort of sphere of activism has widened quite considerably and gone beyond the family law arena to the issues around sex and gender identity. So that sadly means I've been giving less time to the family law issues, although I've seen there are interesting things bubbling up in terms of parental alienation, but I've probably been a bit more distracted of late.
Yeah, so something's come up right now in your life, hasn't it, around the new book that you're about to launch
Yeah. I just thought it would be a nice idea to ask people about what brought them to this whole discussion on sex and gender, because it's such an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? I mean, 10 years ago, nobody was talking about this. None of the phrases which are now trotted out, like sex assigned at birth, no one had even heard of them. So very suddenly, we seem to be in this landscape where what was quite uncontroversial, the fact that sex is formed at conception and immutable thereafter, apparently are now no longer true or subject to lots of qualifications. And I think there are huge implications for the safety and dignity of women, and even worse for the actual health and safety of children, because of course medical transition has exploded as a thing which was virtually unheard of 10 years ago for children. And there's been such a shockingly fast increase, particularly in girls saying they want to be boys. And that does really worry me. And we've seen all the CAS review and now the NHS England specifications and all the court cases. And just today I was having a very busy day with my own court cases and then nipping into the Mermaids charity case where they're trying to get the LGB Alliance stripped of its charitable registration. So it's all very exciting. And I think, yeah, you alluded to lawfare, and that's definitely something I'm quite in favour of, because I think when you're in an urgent situation, it requires an urgent response. And lawfare is not a sustainable strategy over the long term. Everyone's going to get exhausted. But the book I was trying to launch, so to go back to your actual question about people's stories, I just thought it'd be nice to have a historical artifact, because this has been such a bizarre, unprecedented situation. And so there's nothing hateful in the book. It's just people saying, oh, I went to see Jermaine Greer and I suddenly started thinking. And I advertised tickets for the launch event on Eventbrite. And after people complained, they sent me an email going, we're removing it because you're publishing hateful and dangerous content. And I said, no, this is unlawful discrimination, because my belief that sex is real and it matters is now protected by the Equality Act, thanks to the decision of the EAT and Forstater in June 2021. Prior to that, apparently it was not worthy of respect in a democratic society to say that sex is a real thing, which I find
so just to it's amazing, isn't it? But just to tell viewers what that is, so it was a case against the World Development Center by Forster was a visiting lecturer or
something. It was a weird sort of nebulous. She wasn't definitively an employee, but I think she obviously still came within the protections of the Equality Act. She was hopeful she'd be given a more permanent post, I think, and then was quite summarily kicked out for her disgraceful transphobic views that sex is a real thing. And so she got knocked back in the first employment tribunal, and they said that her beliefs were not worthy of protection. And thank goodness she appealed.
Yeah.
Because, this is the danger of warfare.
This is just happening all now, isn't it? This is in the last few years.
It's crazy. I've never seen anything like it. It's just suddenly exploded. And it seems to have come from nowhere, but I suspect it's been in motion for many decades now, and just none of us noticed. Because, of course, it doesn't really impinge, because sex basically isn't relevant for 90% of my day-to-day activities. I can get by quite happily without bothering if you're a boy or a girl. It's just when it is relevant, it's really relevant. And when it's actually impacting on children, and they are being permitted, encouraged to make decisions about their sterilisation at the
And
age
it's
of 10.
experimental medical treatment.
There is no evidence to support the efficacy of medical transition, none at all. I mean, that's what the Cass Review really highlighted. And I'm glad, the Cass Review is now committed to actually proper research, because if there really are children who will benefit from this, let's find out. Let's treat them appropriately. But, to say to a 10-year-old, you're going to embark on a course of treatment that will render you infertile and anorgasmic as an adult. There's no 10-year-old who can get their head around that. It's utterly insane. Anyway, sorry.
So, good to feel a bit of your passion on it. So just to give a bit of context, you've just, I think Eventbrite have gone past your deadline. You were waiting for an apology or something, and it didn't come.
They said interestingly, I emailed them and complained and was ignored. I wrote an article for The Critic, and I was then contacted by their chief legal counsel in California, who read the article. I don't think she'd received any other communication. And she reached out and said, I'd like to know a bit more about your events. We had quite a productive conversation via Zoom on the 3rd. And I said, I do need to move fairly quickly on this. She said, we'll let you know about timescales for review on Monday. So it didn't happen. And so I've got a crowdfunder and sisters ready to go, because I obviously you can't threaten to do this and then not do it. I mean, I'm sad it's come to this, but I think it has the potential to be a really interesting, wider public discussion about how private companies have this sort of power. I mean, they are becoming quasi-public authorities, and that's something my sister was quite interested to explore. They're imposing their own morality on us. They've got no mandate to do this. They've got no accountability. So it raises all sorts of interesting questions. So hopefully crowdfund will be out late tonight. So give us a £5, £10.
Yeah. And you've got form, haven't you? You challenged Wiltshire Police on
Yep.
And Northumbria University. Just tell us quickly about what those things were about.
Oh, well, the Wiltshire Police, this was about the recording of non-crime hate incidents. And I always tell people this because I find it so hilarious. I got 12 pages of tweets that Wiltshire had recorded about me under the title, A Barrister Posting Hate. And one of them was, my dog would call me a Nazi for cheese. And there was a picture of my dog as a puppy. This was recorded as hatred directed towards transgender individuals. And I wrote to the police, I said, you're making yourself look absurd. And that's not good. How can the public have trust and confidence in you if they're laughing at you? And I invited them to withdraw it, and they wouldn't. So I issued a judicial review application against both Wiltshire and the College of Policing. Then Harry went and won his case against the College of Policing.
Harry Miller, so he's an ex-copper, and he was told that he shouldn't be, but that was about gender.
His was just as ludicrous as mine. I mean, they recorded some tweets. They said he was transphobic. One of the tweets said, "Huh?" ? He couldn't even remember what it was in response to. And as the judge found at his hearing, he wasn't in the foothills of harassment. He had done nothing wrong. His speech might not have been sophisticated, but it was protected political speech. So the College of Policing had to admit that their guidelines were wrong. Wiltshire Police then caved and agreed to delete the recordings and pay 90% of my costs. My action is still live because we're waiting for the government to produce a code of conduct linked to NCHIs. Which
was that precipitated by the case? Or, right, brilliant.
The policing have revised their guidance to bring it more in line with what the Court of Appeal said, which was basically you can't just have perception-based recording because you can't weed out the malicious. And that's always been mine and Harry's point. You're encouraging malicious people to use this as a tool of oppression and harassment against people they don't.
So broad, yeah.
Yeah. So the Court of Appeal said, it cannot be that broad because it's a breach of Article 10. So the College of Policing did revise guidance, which was okay, a bit incoherent. But at the same time, there was an amendment to one of the acts before Parliament, one of the bills, that said there ought to be a statutory code of conduct on this issue, code of practice. So that won't be coming out now until next year because of the chaos of government. So my action is now on day 728. So, this is the problem with lawfare. Although I say it's an urgent response, it can drag on for years. That's a bit of a question.
And you're good at raising the money. There's one of your blogs, one of your articles somewhere, and it lists all the cases like yours and all the money that's been raised, and it's up, it's over 2 million now, or similar.
Oh, it's over 3 million now.
3 million, okay. Yeah, so it's working. People are willing to.
Yes and no. I think people are getting tired. I mean, my crowdfund. Well, I wasn't pushing my crowdfunder because obviously we're in this state of limbo, but it's stalled at about 45,000, and all of that money is gone. We haven't even got inside a court, so it's not a long-term strategy because litigation is ridiculously expensive. But I do think it can get such amazing results. I think both Harry and Maya Forstater showed that. I mean, both their cases are sort of the absolute, the ace up your sleeve. You can just say, look at Miller, look at Forstater, and that's what lawfare can give you.
Yeah, it's massive. And with Northumbria University, you
they backed down straight away, bless them. I think I emailed them pointing out 4 or 5 ways they'd acted unlawfully by intercepting my emails. And they just said, yes, we're very sorry, we won't do it again. So
okay. So thanks for that. And I just want to read what the last paragraph of that article in the Critic, because you've named some of the concerns, but I get from your work and your writing as well, there's actually a kind of macro sort of meta concern here about the fabric of civilization. You said,
absolutely.
Contemptuous breach of the rule of law is a direct threat to a functioning democracy and denial of material reality that should be a matter of concern to us all. And I think that's a really nice segue into family courts and the nucleus of our civilization and our communities and what we're doing, what we think we're doing here. Because it's a place where the atomization of families and communities is happening at scale, isn't it? It's a lot of families going through that process, and there's a lot of contact being lost. A lot of. I
don't think you can say the courts are not responsible for the atomization of the family. I mean, the family is already exploded by the time it gets to court. The court is just the very imperfect mechanism, the only arena that these families have to try and resolve disputes. And that's why it's failing, because these are not legal disputes, are they? They're emotional.
Yeah.
So, the family courts are not responsible for that. They are merely trying with very imperfect tools to reach solutions.
Yes.
But they don't have the tools and the solutions are not available. So the family does not benefit from going to family court. But there's nowhere else for them to go. If 2 parents are absolute loggerheads about how to raise their child, if they can't mediate, if they've got no family members, the court is their only arena.
And yes, and originally it came across your work because of a piece you wrote in Family Law Journal magazine on non-direct contact.
Yeah.
So child arrangements orders where the judge essentially says, okay, well, just send, usually to the father, but sometimes the mother, just send your child cards and gifts and, see what happens. And your experience and what you say in that paper is actually this is counterproductive, and actually it needs to be dealt with much sooner if there's an what do you call it? You call it implacable hostility. I think that's one of the phrases you use. It needs to be acknowledged that if usually the resident parent is implacably hostile, then that kind of needs to be dealt with straight away rather than letting letting it get cemented.
It's just such a good example of a sop kicking something down the road, kicking it into the long grass, not having to deal with it. And as we pointed out, there is no research at all on the efficacy of indirect contact. And if there were, it would conclude it has no positive benefit, because you can't have a relationship with a child by writing notes to them. I mean, that's would never work. I mean, and it doubly doesn't work in today's society because we don't write letters to one another anymore. Children are not, there just isn't this culture. Even if there were, how on earth, a letter once a month can possibly be a substitute for a relationship with a parent? It's mind-boggling.
So
but it's simply a sop.
So why are the judges and the Kafkas officers, you quote this figure, so 58%, so you actually asked Families Need Fathers, which is a charity that supports non-resident fathers. So there were 154 service users surveyed. 58% of them said that someone in a position of authority suggested that wait and see might work. Wait and see being, oh yeah, just do this non-direct contact for a while. And the Kafkas caseworker was the most likely person to actually say that. And then, so 37% of the time it was a Kafkas caseworker, and 34% of the time it was the judge.
Yeah, well, it's a way of getting a win. You can say, oh, that case ended with a contact order. Well, yes, but it was an order for indirect contact. And there's no follow-up. The child won't be tracked to see if they have a relationship with the parent a year down the line. So it's a way of avoiding making difficult decisions, acknowledging harsh truths, and claiming a sort of victory. But it's terribly dishonest because there's no evidence to back it up as a sustainable or efficacious practice at all.
I've never come across a client of mine who thought that their cards or their gifts were actually getting through.
Well, of course not. If there's not a supportive environment, and given that there's indirect contact's been ordered, you can assume that it almost certainly isn't, then those cards and letters are not going to be received well. Children are not going to be encouraged to read them or to keep them or to treasure them or to write back. And it does actually become something quite harmful, because it's seen as a way of the alienated parent, the absent parent, inserting themselves back in to this happy unit where they're not wanted. And it's utterly dreadful. And if it worked, there would be evidence that it worked, and there isn't.
There's no evidence at all, is there? And there's no oversight, and the family court is secretive, so there's no monitoring about it.
It's private because children have a right not to have all of these embarrassing, sordid details in the public domain. But it's a huge block to actually proper research and understanding.
But can't it be anonymized and still analysed?
There's a huge risk of jigsaw identification. So anonymization it's not simply a case of stripping the names out, because often it's very easy to identify people from the facts. Now there's this big push for getting more and more judgments published, and it's going to be absolutely doomed because the judges at the moment are given no help in preparing anonymized judgments. It's a big piece of work. They haven't got the time for it. So I think lots of people are worried about how, you say secrecy, I say privacy, but regardless of the word we use, it has a chilling effect on research, on ability to understand the long-term effects of orders, and that's not great. But simply saying, oh, publish more judgments, without giving the judges any backup support, it's a nonsense. So we're just going round and round in circles. And what's happened is a group of people have managed then to capture even the Ministry of Justice. And I'm talking about the group called The Court Said, which is run by Natalie Page. They're very big on lived experience. And what they mean is completely unverified statements of women who say the family court is a tool of misogynistic oppression. And they are never checked. They're never fact checked. How can they be? Because they can't share any details of their cases. So we're in this awful position where one group seems to have seized control of law and policymakers with no evidence, and all these ridiculous, unevidenced theories are being touted as best practice. It is a mess. No, I quite agree it's a mess. I don't think it's deliberately vindictive, malicious mess, as some people maintain. but it's not a good place for families.
And I've come across many legal practitioners who are fighting the good fight, like yourself. So I think there can be a tendency for non-resident parents who have lost contact to see, well, especially fathers, to see it in binary terms, in these sort of polarized terms. So yeah, the family court is against men. So it's almost like the opposite of what you've just described, that group.
A whole group of women saying the family court hates women. So,
Yeah.
you know, these two polarized extremes, both blaming the family courts for doing exactly the opposite things.
Yeah.
But it just shows, you know, an adversarial arena is not a place for frightened, traumatized, or angry people, because it simply makes them even more emotional and even less able to understand the wider context or to reason. I mean, and this is the problem. I mean, alienation just doesn't happen. I mean, I said this at a Families Need Fathers conference, and I could see various men in the audience getting really angry with me. But I'm saying I've never come across a case where someone is 100% a victim and someone 100% a perpetrator. Your relationship with the woman that you chose to share your genetic material with, sometimes over and over again, is a dynamic. You're both responsible for how you got into this mess. And I do find it incredible, you know. I'm always accused of victim blaming when I say this, but you know, to be with someone for 20 years and have 3 or 4 children with them, and at the end of it, you know, come and see me and say they're a monster. I'm like, well, why have you only just noticed? And of course, you know, there's things have been bubbling under for years, and when you're relatively happy, you overlook various behaviours and faults. Once you're in an adversarial fighting position, then the other person very sadly becomes a monster. And of course, it's rarely true. But this is not the arena. I'm not a psychotherapist. I can't counsel my clients, but I do think that's what they need more than a court experience. Some sort of family therapy, but you can't force people down that road.
I strongly agree. Yeah, and they need to be ready. They need to make that choice for themselves.
Yeah. Otherwise, well, therapy is absolutely pointless if you don't come to it with an open heart and a willingness. And most people, by the time they get to the family courts, are so entrenched in this warfare. You know, the other side is the enemy. It's about winning and losing, and then of course the children get completely overlooked.
So, is your thinking there that this state of affairs that's exacerbated by adversarial court in this country, actually produces the context in which parental alienation happens, and maybe it would.
I think I don't know if this is just true of English society or other societies do it better. I doubt they do. There's no education about relationships and what a healthy relationship looks like. We're simply expected to get on with it. You fall in love, get married, and have a baby. And there is such a dearth of emotional intelligence, of dealing with conflict in relationships, even having the conversations before you have the child. How are we going to discipline this child? How are we going to educate this child? What time will this child go to bed? And if people get into these situations where they've shared their genetic material with somebody, they've now created another human life, but they are totally without the tools to navigate the inevitable disagreements. And some people, I think, you know, make very poor choices. They don't consider their personality, their temperaments. They base choices, I think, on things other than how's this relationship going to look 20 years down the line. And I don't think people get much help. There isn't much help. There's all this stigma, isn't there, about getting support and therapy, and you're told to soldier on, and relationships are difficult. And then when it all goes horribly wrong, you end up in a family court, which is not the arena for your problem, because your problem is not a legal problem. It's manifestly not a legal problem. There's very little law in family law. It simply says, you know, the child has a right to relationship with both parents if it's safe to do so. The child's best interests are paramount. I mean, that's basically it. You don't really need to know much more law.
Yeah, and in your paper, where is it? You made the point that in all those cases of the Families Need Fathers service users, these were cases in which there wasn't deemed to be any risk, any safeguarding risk, and contact with both parents was deemed to be in the child's best interest.
Yeah, but what What it's so difficult because the children usually end up living with one of the parents. They set the emotional weather in the home for the children. When I had a case not that long ago where we've got a guardian saying these children need to see their dad. All right, the breakup was horrible. Dad behaved in a way that he's regretted, but in terms of shouting, not in terms of punching. And yet the mother's narrative is the children have been so traumatized by their father's appalling behavior that any attempts at therapy will just re-traumatize them. Now, that's not what the expert says, but that's what she says. And whatever the court says, the mother will control this case because the children live with her. And she will not move away from that framing, that narrative. And what is the court to do? Put her in prison? Well, that will simply entrench the children's hostility towards their father. And where are they going to live? They will refuse to live with their father. So the children go to foster care, she goes into prison. I mean, I'm constantly being told, often by my male clients, that this is the answer, enforcement. But unless the children can move to live with their father, I think that's the only real solution to these cases. There is no method of enforcement. We don't have enough prisons to put all the defaulting parents in. So we're really, really stuck. It's very, very difficult.
Is that why they're not enforced? Because I don't know what the figure is. It's very low though, isn't it? It's only about 2 or 3% of orders.
The only weapons you've got are fines or imprisonment. There's absolutely no appetite to send a child's parent to prison, particularly if that child's got nowhere else to go. Because in a lot of the cases of implacable hostility, they won't have seen or even spoken to their dad for years. So they can't go here. So foster care, put mum in prison. And of course, that will simply entrench her and the children in their views that this father is a monster. Look what he's made the courts do. I mean, this is what really, really troubles me. The kind of narratives being put forward by the court said, I mean, these women genuinely believe they've been the victims of the most hideous abuse. And I'm afraid, in some cases it's true. And in some cases, I don't think it is true. But there's a culture where you get more points for being a victim, don't you? And you're encouraged.
I'm glad you brought that up. It's because there's a very strong link between hate crimes and domestic abuse. Like some examples of domestic abuse used in court is not showing feelings to your partner or putting your partner on a pedestal or disagreeing with your partner.
And if you don't, I mean, I had one case where the woman said she was the victim of the most appalling coercive control because the father wouldn't let her buy a car. And the judge just went, this was a sensible financial decision. You didn't have any money, but for her, it was reframed as really vicious, coercive control.
Holding money,
And luckily the judge said, no, this is what couples have to negotiate. You did not have the money. He wouldn't let me have another credit card. Well, and it's so frustrating. But I think you're quite right. It's a really interesting parallel. It's why hate crime is going to fail, and it's why coercive control is failing, both in the criminal courts and the civil courts, because the same act, depending on the lens with which you see it, can have completely different ramifications. And I've got lots of fathers saying, yeah, but I was trying to be nice. No, he policed what I was wearing. I just said I thought she looked nice in that skirt. And I feel really sorry for both of them because, I don't know, maybe he didn't say it as nicely as he thought, but now his ex is firmly of the belief that he is an abuser and a coercive controller.
Right, but also people, if the relationship isn't going particularly well, people aren't very nice to each other sometimes, especially if the relationship is ending. It's not pretty.
People do not have the tools either to enter a relationship responsibly or leave it compassionately. We appear, I don't know if this is a species problem or just a English problem. I'm actually not aware of any other country does it any better. But of course, it hits you exactly where it hurts, doesn't it? The loss of your family. I mean, it's basically the fear of being thrown out of your tribe and dying in the wilderness, isn't it? It's very
that is neurologically, that's death, isn't it? An emotion.
Exactly. So being rejected by your family, losing your family is terrifying on every level. So I'm not trying to blame people. I'm just saying it would be great if we could have a culture that encouraged more support, more education, more therapy, just to try and get people through this, but they've got nothing.
So you've seen more of this muck than most humans alive, I imagine. You know, you've been in family court proceedings for 20 years. So how what everything you're saying is logical, and yet and these people, you know, maybe there's a few bad actors, but overall everyone's doing their best, aren't they? The judges, the professionals, and so every time I ask different people who work in different parts of this machine, this question, I always get a really depressing answer. But what is it? What is it that's going to work? Is it reform? Is it legislation? Is it just taking responsibility?
I think it's going right back to the points I'm raising about education, about people need to identify what a positive relationship is. Because I think the problem is things get really bad when people are trying to cling on to or get out of a toxic relationship. It's just emotional misery upon emotional misery. And of course, by the time you've got 2 or 3 children in the mix, it's hell on earth. And I just don't see that there's any mechanism of family court or arbitration or mediation that can sort that out. It's too late. We have to go way back, go upstream. Why are people falling in? And I do think it's just a dearth of advice, compassion, support, therapy, just encouraging people to talk to one another. I'm just astonished at the number of people who will meet, get married, have children, and they haven't even talked about the fundamentals, their attitude to money, their attitude to children. I don't know, it just seems incredible. And I suppose, I don't know if we used to have more of that. I mean, when you get married in church and you have to go and see the vicar and he'd give you advice, well, that obviously didn't work because people were still miserable.
And there would have been a conversation about the estate, the asset base, and all that sort of stuff. That would have been kind of,
maybe it's just pie in the sky, because I mean, maybe this was tried earlier when society was a bit more rigid and structured. Of course, that didn't work, and everyone was totally miserable. And I think we're all miserable in a different way now, aren't we? People were miserable when marriages were much more difficult to get out of. And well, they're miserable.
They were more of a kind of survival pact, weren't they? I'll go and do the work if you hold the fort here, and we'll get through. And it's not about being happy. But I guess since sort of third wave feminism, it's become, actually, we need to be happy as well.
Yeah, well, when I see women like my mother who were totally miserable, I completely get that. I mean, marriage shouldn't be a trap. You shouldn't say to women, well, that's it. You give up any aspirations you have for a career. You're just here to service this marriage. And that seems to be what my mother and her generation went through. I mean, I wouldn't say that men and women are much happier now, though. This is the problem. We're just unhappier in different ways. I don't think a family court system works. I think that basically whatever we do, we need to do it quicker. I think we need to triage cases more effectively. So identify the implacably hostile and deal with them quickly.
Yeah.
But have a cheaper, less cumbersome mechanism for parents who maybe just need a bit of help to sort out a contact order. Because I would say it is probably only about 10% of cases which are really awful, the implacably hostile ones, but they're the ones in the court system until the children age out. So 8, 9, 10 years.
God.
And they achieve nothing. They waste an enormous amount of public money. And, that's all the child knows of their childhood, is their parents being in court. So I think we've really got to triage. Maybe my wish for universal education is a bit pie in the sky, but maybe that could be going on. Do something in schools. I don't know, beef that up a bit. Encourage people to talk openly and honestly about their relationship goals. Then if it all goes horribly wrong, have a streamlined tribunal system and save court proceedings and enforcement for the really, really bad ones.
Yeah.
But that would need a triage, because at the moment we don't triage any cases effectively from what I can see.
No. What about mandatory mediation and a bit of a carrot and a stick thing around? Yeah. So I think I'm right in saying there's some places in the world that have an assumption of 50-50 or thereabouts. I think there's somewhere in Spain, somewhere in Kentucky.
I used to be very skeptical about that, but now I'm thinking it could actually be a good idea.
Well, as you said, you were just saying to triage. I saw somewhere, I think I was on Judge Wildblood's meeting last year or something, and someone was saying, if we just had the assumption of 50-50 contact or near enough, you could probably shove a big percentage of cases through that, and then the ones where there was a big argument around that, you could put them into another stream. So you might be able to just kind of get.
I used to be very sceptical because I thought it is antithetical to the paramountcy of the child's welfare. But you're right, it doesn't stop there being an investigation into that, and it might actually tip us away from what I think we're getting into really dangerous waters, where this group that say men are the oppressors and violent and hideous, they are actually getting the upper hand in terms of law and policy. We had this big Court of Appeal case earlier this year, which I think was designed by Charlotte Proudman and the others to completely destroy the family justice system and have it recognise it was utterly rubbish and it couldn't deal with all these violent men. Now, they didn't get what they wanted. And in fact, I think it was a bit of a shot themselves in the foot moment, because what it did was make the courts look really carefully about the need for findings of fact. And post that Court of Appeal judgment, the court's been saying, actually, no, the behaviour you're alleging, although unpleasant, not kind, is not sufficiently serious to justify the court time of finding a fact, and it's not sufficiently serious to rule this father out. So that's certainly not what Proudman and her team wanted to achieve. So I just think she's ghastly, and she's part of the big problem that we've got.
Yeah, this hatefulness, looking at her content, her tweets.
Well, she's blocked me, which I think is very indicative of a problem. I mean, for a lawyer to block another lawyer, I've done it on a very rare occasion, but only because they've been completely abusive. I think that's only happened once, actually, in all this time I've been on social media. I mean, it's just indicative of not being willing to be challenged, because I'm blunt and confrontational, but I don't think I'm abusive. I don't swear at people. I don't harass them. I will say, I think you're wrong because of this reason. And for another lawyer not to be willing to engage in that process is really disturbing. But I don't think people like Proudman are lawyers. They're campaigners. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you shouldn't be wearing a different hat where you're actually a single issue lobbyist. You shouldn't be pretending to be a more broad spectrum legal person. I mean, her view is simply that the family courts are a tool of misogynistic oppression. And I think they would really ideally like, men to be utterly deprived of any voice in the family proceedings. That's one extreme, and that doesn't help, because of course there are violent and unpleasant men, just as there are extremely manipulative and unpleasant women.
But quite a low base rate. Yeah,
most people are fine, but you get these awful, the 10% of cases where things have gone really wrong, and I would say they're roughly half and half: violent, dangerous men and dangerous and manipulative women. It's not a sex-based problem here. Both sexes have the capacity to really screw their children up. It isn't a men versus women issue. Obviously, I think the way in which men and women display their dysfunction can differ, simply because women are smaller and weaker. I don't think we tend to be physically violent in the way that a lot of men do. But in terms of emotional manipulation, I mean, it's very clear that women are very good at that.
But in public family law cases, the local authorities have an obligation to make sure the child sees both parents, even if there are issues, don't they? But the children sort of get lost in private law proceedings often.
Yeah, well, they're very difficult. They're very different. I mean, public law proceedings, I have to say, often the father just isn't there. The father is either not known or the father's in prison. So it's a very different dynamic. It's a lot more of my cases, simply the focus is on the mother because, well, the father's not playing an active role in prison.
Yeah, because I read one of your pieces that said, in 20 years, you've been doing so many cases with parents and children with learning disabilities. And actually, you've yet to see a case where the child gets to stay with those parents.
Well, because unless you've got good family support, you cannot buy in professionally the kind of support these parents need. it wouldn't be fair on the children, because you'd be getting a stream of people coming in and out of the children's lives.
Yeah.
Unless you've got a good auntie, a decent granny who'll stick around, because a lot of these parents are so disabled, they cannot safely bring up a child. They need 24/7 support. So absent family members, it's just not feasible. But that is the tragedy for most of my clients. They don't have effective family support. Very often they have been abused and hurt by their own families. So that's just a whole other dimension of sadness. But again, it's a perfect example of people's unwillingness to face difficult truths. We don't face that truth head on. What we do is then engage in a very expensive assessment process when we all know what the outcome's going to be. That gives the parents false hope, and it's unfair and cruel.
What's the impact of all of this been on you over the years? You said
not very much, because I think I'm probably a bit psychopathic. I think you have to be. You can't do this job if you're really empathetic, because you can't take on people's pain. It will destroy you. So I think there's probably a bit of ice where my heart ought to be. But I'm not going to be effective if I'm, too busy sobbing with somebody about how tragic it is.
Yeah.
It's just very difficult. But you can't obviously let go all human compassion and empathy, because then you are a monster. So I think I don't know. Maybe I'm just lucky. It's my temperament. I've been able to tread that line. I can really feel. Hopefully, I can feel and understand what people are going through, but it doesn't affect me, and that I don't take it home with me.
Yeah, but also you're channeling that. There's something. There's some. You're not just doing it for the money, are you? Otherwise, why would you be doing all these campaigns? You're interested in.
I think it's
the meaning.
Yeah, I'm very interested in relationships and people's interactions. I think it's fascinating. Human psychology is fascinating. The way we structure our society, it is really interesting. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I don't think you can do anything for 20 years unless you've got an interest and a passion for it, no matter what, because you just get really bored.
And just at this time, it's been described as the culture wars, hasn't it? You seem to be right in the middle of it, right in the coalface. And I read some of your words around. You were talking about kind of breaking down the idea of performative. Yeah, it was about positive affirmative action. Is that the term? Affirmative action, and why positive discrimination, why it's actually counterproductive. And you made a really interesting point there, which is that it doesn't work and it actually causes harm. Can you just say a bit around how you got to that? There was something there around this performative virtue signaling.
Is probably my superpower, actually, because it's kept me in touch with reality. It's given me.
What was that? I missed what did you say?
Being disabled, actually, you said, well, how have you come to this? How have you survived? And I think probably, having a physical disability, which I do, means that you are fully grounded in reality. You have a sense of perspective. So you are, what a problem is and what it isn't. And it also makes me incredibly impatient with what we now see around us, which is sheer performance, coloured lanyards, laces. And of course, what disabled people need is changes to physical infrastructure. They need actual support. I'm not going to get anywhere with a lanyard. And that infuriates me. And I think it's been quite healthy, because it's enabled me to cut through the fog. Because people who are not disabled, people who are aware of their privilege, I think do feel a bit guilty and don't want to say the wrong thing, and are held hostage by people who will exploit that weakness. But I guess I've always been able to cut through that, because I know exactly what it is like to be disabled. And I don't find performance and virtue signaling in the least bit interesting. And frankly, it's very annoying. So yeah, that's probably given me a way to withstand this utter bizarreness that's going on now, that people are, things that we never even thought of 5-10 years ago are now common currency. It's just astonishing. Do
you think there's an agenda behind it?
Yeah, without wishing to sound too conspiracy minded, I think when you trace it back, this whole thing about getting rid of sex was going on, I think, since the late 1990s. and there were various efforts to change the law and sneak laws in. And it really all seems to have kicked off for us around 2015, when Stonewall were persuaded to start advocating for trans people, and they made that the focus of their fundraising, and just incredibly quickly seemed to manage to capture every state institution, police, the civil service. I mean, it's shocking how quickly. And I think, but they were very clever because they rode the wave of acceptance of homosexuality. Because, you know, we go from almost castrating Alan Turing to then accepting same-sex marriage. Quite rightly. Of course, you should be able to marry who you want to marry. You're not subverting reality if you're a man who wants to marry another man. Good luck to you. I hope you're really happy. But then the whole trans thing was yoked very successfully. So if you don't support trans people, you're just as bad as those homophobes who wouldn't let men and women get married. And nobody wants to be that awful person. So it was a very clever capture. And of course it happened without, I mean, I wasn't really aware any of this was going on. So it was well embedded before women like me woke up. But I think in the past couple of years we've had pretty good success in turning the ship around. It would have been good to wake up a bit sooner, get in there a bit earlier.
What was it that pulled you into this space?
Oh, simply that I got threatened on Twitter. Somebody said they were going to report me to my employer for my hate. I think I just said something, but you can't change sex. You know, I'd said something completely innocuous. And, you know, I'm completely the wrong personality type to do that to. Because if you threaten me, you just inspire me to escalate, basically. You know, there are a couple, I don't know what personality type that is. You know, we're a minority personality type, but we're fairly prevalent. It's just not the way to deal with us. You know, you threaten us, we come back. And it doesn't make me sound very noble, but I'm afraid that was it. That I thought, well, if I'm being threatened, then there's something here I need to investigate. And
yeah, it's from the point of view of I'll discover the truth now that I've got this motivation because I'm being called out. So
and it's always been my own personal philosophy. From Carl Rogers, the psychologist in the 50s, he just said brilliantly, the facts are always friendly. There is nothing dangerous or unsatisfying about being closer to the truth. And that's always been my personal philosophy. So I'm not invested in being right. I'm quite happy to be wrong because that means I've learned something. But I think a lot of people now seem to tie up their entire identity in being right about whatever ideology they've cottoned on to. And that's really dangerous because you have to embrace changing your mind when the facts change.
Especially social workers. And I was reading about your open letter to the Council of Europe. And yeah, just so many fascinating points. There's the positive discrimination case. But these points in that open letter, I'll just read them out. I think they're really universal. They're not confined to that at all. Yeah, you said, we write to ask for your commitment to protect and uphold the human rights of all. Yeah. A recognition of the harmful consequences of attempting to set one group against another on the basis of unevidenced and hyperbolic assertions. And recognition that asserting the reality of biological sex and the consequences this has for women and children is not and can never be bigotry or transphobia.
Yep.
Because the UK, I didn't know about this till I read your piece. The Council of Europe condemned the UK for virulent attacks on the rights of LGBTI people.
They put us on a par with Russia and Turkey. I mean, it is risible, but people are lapping this up. I mean, what they mean by virulent attacks is women saying, we're not going to cede you our rights to single-sex spaces. That is not a virulent attack on trans people. That is women standing up for their rights protected at law. And yet it is reframed as hatred and bigotry. It's just infuriating. And to say that we are on par with Turkey and Russia, well, I suggest to some of these groups that they go and live in Turkey and Russia and then, get a sense of just how bloody lucky they were to live in this society, which on any metric is way up there in terms of tolerance, acceptance, respect, rule of law. It really does infuriate me. I think we've just created a generation of people who've never known a war, who've not known what it's like to have their fundamental freedoms restricted. And they just don't get it. They just do not realize how lucky they are. And it's all about this, I'm the biggest victim. It's infuriating.
Mm.
And it does, of course, have a direct impact on democracy and the rule of law, because if people are demanding that their opinions are treated as facts, then the whole structure of society unravels. So when people say, oh, why are you always banging on about this sex and gender thing? Why is it so important? I say, because it strikes at the very foundations, the glue that holds society together. So the rule of law, which informs a healthy democracy, it won't survive if people are demanding that their opinions are facts, and anyone who challenges them is reported to the police. And that's sort of where, certainly this time last year, that's where we were at. I think we've made inroads into that, thank goodness. Mm. So just, just to go back full circle to Eventbrite, it'll be very interesting to see how they react, because the terms of service seem to suggest that I can only bring legal action against them pursuant to the laws of the state of California. And I don't accept that. They operate in the UK. They're making a profit of UK citizens. They are going to obey our laws. If they're allowed to operate here and not obey our laws, then isn't that a direct attack on parliamentary sovereignty? This is really scary, and it has.
Glad you said that word, sovereignty, because that's what this is all about, isn't it? It's national sovereignty, it's individual sovereignty.
Yeah.
It's personal responsibility to protect that as well.
It's about accountability. I mean, that's all the hoo-ha over Europe, wasn't it? People didn't want laws being imposed on them when they hadn't actually voted for the people making the laws, and I get that. So I think with the government's really got to get to grips with big tech, because of course they largely originate from America, but they've got tentacles all over. But if they are actually going to get away with saying California state law is what is you're going to be subject to, well, I'm not a citizen of California. I live in the United Kingdom, and I've got rights pursuant to the Equality Act, and I'm being discriminated against, and I'm really pissed off about it, because it's awful to smear me and the 85 people who bought a ticket to the book launch to say that we are promoting violence, danger, and hatred. It's ludicrous, and I won't stand for it. But I need people to give me money though, so hopefully the crowdfunder will be up fairly soon. Check this email.
Are you familiar with the books, The Sovereign Individuals, published in the late 90s? And it kind of, I'm just curious about where do you think the nation state is entering into some kind of transformation?
I don't know. I mean, when you say sovereign individuals, that has a bit of a whiff of freemen on the land. Would I be in the right area there?
What's that?
The freemen of the land.
Freemen of the land.
Who declare themselves unencumbered by the laws of the country in which they live.
Right.
Run-ins with them.
It loosely, there's a lot in it, but it sort of says this mix of cryptocurrency, a predicted cryptocurrency, like 20 years, 10 years ahead, internet, so like remote working.
No, you're right. National book boundaries are having less and less relevance.
The ability of the state to tax according to geography is kind of falling away, and the legitimacy of the state to overcharge for services.
No, absolutely. These are all massive things which I haven't given any thought to, because I've been so focused on sex and gender. But it just boils down to me about accountability. People can put up with all manner of things if they think it's fair, if they think they've been listened to. And I do find that really interesting in my job. I mean, there was a fascinating study of doctors in America that showed those doctors that spent just an extra 5 minutes with their patients were far less likely to be sued, because the patient felt listened to. And that's the danger here, isn't it? If people just feel they're being trampled on. And that's what I want to bring back. Really, just accountability, transparency and accountability. Yeah. And I think that sort of ties everything together. The family court doesn't have that. All the horrible debate about sex and gender doesn't have that. And I can see it's going to be really difficult as national boundaries just become completely eroded. As you say, if you're not reliant on that country's currency, if you can work wherever, you just need an internet connection. So yeah, it'd be very interesting. That's why I think the Eventbrite action might chip away at a few of those issues.
Do you want to just say where people can find you, and if they want to get involved in that crowdfunder? Or...
Well, I seem to be on Twitter far too much. If they want to have a look on Twitter, of course, I've got my website, Child Protection Resource Online. I've got a Substack. I'm sort of all over the place, really.
What's your Twitter handle?
I'm at SV Phillimore.
Okay. And what's the just say what the Child Protection Resource Centre is.
It's just trying to gather together accurate information about the child protection system and trying to portray it in fairly understandable language. And to be brutally selfish, it's a brilliant resource for me, because whenever I do an interesting case, I can write about it. I'm not then reinventing the wheel. I can go back to my own website and remind myself. So hopefully it's a valuable resource for anybody who's involved in the child protection system. I talk about some private law issues as well. Obviously, parental alienation is the big one. But it's mainly about public law cases.
Well, thank you so much for all your hard work and your brilliant writing, and I find you very inspiring person.
Oh, thank you.
Called yourself a psychopath, but yeah, maybe we need psychopaths who can be compassionate, and
hopefully that's over-egging the pudding, but there's definitely something, a G missing in me, which I think has served me well. I remember all my friends, when their babies would cry, they'd get really upset, and I'd be like, what? So that's probably the only way I've been able to do this job for 20 years and stay sane. So yeah, but yeah, we need all sorts of people. We need the compassionate ones. We need the touchy-feely ones. We need everybody, because we have to have balance. And maybe that's the key word, of not transparency, not accountability, but just balance. And that's what's missing in so many areas now. Oh, well, thank you very much for that opportunity to have a rant. I enjoyed that.
I really enjoyed it. Yeah, all the best with your new fight.
Need some money.
I'll be watching. Yeah.
Very much.
Thank
Okay.
you. And yeah, take care. Thank you.
Night night.